Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Framework Soup, Understanding the Difference Between Risk Management Control and Reporting Frameworks. Today's webinar is a collaboration between Intraprise Health and HITRUST. Intraprise Health is an industry-leading tech-enabled healthcare cybersecurity and risk management services provider and one of the longest tenured HITRUST assessors in the industry. We also offer a broad range of information security, privacy, and compliance services, including third-party risk management, NIST cybersecurity framework adoption, HITRUST remediation management, and HITRUST optimization services, as well as HIPAA security risk assessments via our HIPAA One platform. Intraprise Health holds 2 seats on the HITRUST Assessor Council and 1 seat on the Quality Assurance Subcommittee. This webinar will last about 45 minutes, and I'd like to go through some tips on using the webinar. You can chat with your host if you run into any technical difficulties. All lines are muted for sound quality. Please send any questions via the question box, which should be on the right side or bottom side of your screen. We will try to wrap up the webinar in 45 minutes, leaving a couple of minutes at the end for questions. So with that, I would like to introduce our 2 presenters. Today we have Ryan Patrick, who is Intraprise Health's Senior Vice President of Security, as well as Mike Parisi, HITRUST Vice President of Business Development and Adoption. Thanks both of you for joining us, and with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Siobhan. Thanks everybody for joining. The topic that we're going to cover today is somewhat of a confusing one, and I want to set a little context. But before I do so, I want to hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Mike, to give us some opening comments.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is something a little different than what I think we've presented on in the past, or at least Ryan and I. Intraprise has been a long-standing partner of ours here at HITRUST, and we've done a number of presentations in the market together, and we were looking for a new topic to address and provide some perspective on it, and we thought this one was interesting as we talked to a lot of our common customers and organizations that are trying to address common information security and privacy challenges. We find that there's a lot of confusion when it comes to quote-unquote frameworks and assurances that are being provided over those frameworks. And the way that we like to talk about it is that not all frameworks are created equal, and not all levels of assurance are created equal. So we're going to have a conversation today to talk about what are all these different types of frameworks, the pros and cons, when you should use them, when you should not use them, and really address the fact that there is no one single risk management control or reporting framework that organizations can necessarily settle on. It needs to be a combination of all in many instances. And we'll talk about how you can integrate that and address that in the most efficient and effective way possible. And then pivot to how do you provide assurances over those different frameworks based upon what your stakeholders are asking you to do. So thanks for joining us today. Ryan, I'll hand it back to you to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I want to set a little context to the conversation we're going to have today. One, it's exactly that. It's designed to be a conversation. So I encourage everybody to submit your questions via the question chat box function. We will look at that throughout the entire presentation. As the conversation is lending itself to that question, we'll likely answer it. If not, we'll definitely get to it at the end. But don't hesitate, don't wait until the end, because it's really important to us that you get your questions answered on this topic. Little context in the conversation. So we're going to talk about different types of frameworks. The first couple of slides, I want you to put your minds as if we're talking about it in a vacuum. And you'll see why that makes sense towards the end of the presentation. Ultimately, there's ways to bleed them all together, but it's really understanding what each one does in a vacuum that helps you understand how to integrate them and how to use something that integrates all types of frameworks in a coherent and comprehensive way. So we want to start off with a poll question. So the poll question should pop up on your screen. Which controls-based risk management framework does your organization use to manage your information security and privacy programs today? So there's a couple of them out there. This is not an all-encompassing list. We're just trying to get a feel for what everybody's using, what may be working, what seems to be more relied upon, and things of that nature. So if you can answer that question, the results should pop up here pretty quickly, but we'll continue on in the conversation. So the first topic we're going to talk about are risk management frameworks. So what is a risk management framework? Well, basically, it's a framework that does exactly what it sounds like. It puts risk as the center of gravity. That's what you're specifically focused on. And there's a lot of deliberate steps in adopting a risk management framework. So you have to, like a lot of things that you see coming out of NIST, 830, the controls in 800-53, you have to categorize your systems. You have to identify your systems, their sensitivity. Once you're able to do that, you select a number of controls in order to minimize the risk, because again, risk is the center of gravity. Then you're going to look to actually mitigate those risks, assess the effectiveness, and then this is one step that's very prevalent in industries like the Department of Defense, where there's an authorization for use. So what we see typically is people will go through these steps and then they'll already have implemented a lot of these controls, whereas in the Department of Defense specifically, there's an actual approval process that the owner of that information and the owner of that environment has to approve it before it goes into full production. But ultimately, you want to monitor the risks and any degradation to any of the controls that may be in place. As we all know, things that come out like encryption standards and things of that nature, they, based on increased computing power, may be able to be decrypted more easily. Think about SSL versus TLS and all the different versions of TLS. But what a risk management framework does is it kind of gives you, and which a lot of frameworks do, it gives you a common lexicon. It gives you a common methodology in working through risk management. So the real question is, what are the benefits of it? One of the biggest benefits is you are empowered as an organization to select your controls and implement it based on risk, because not everybody is the same. Every industry is different. Even organizations within industries have different threat vectors. They have different risk tolerances, and it really gives you the power to decide, hey, this is my risk tolerance. These are the types of controls based on the budget that I have that I want to put in place. It's very business model driven execution. So it's not someone from on high saying, hey, you have to do it this way. It's very inclusive of, or it's very focused on the organization and its specific drivers. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, and you can internally determine the effectiveness. Some shortcomings of risk management frameworks: they're not really prescriptive, right? Because there's so much flexibility, there's a converse to that. You're not being told exactly what you should put in place, and there's nothing saying this will work. The framework actually, because of the flexibility, gives you a very subjective view on selecting those. So if you're looking for how to protect certain types of data, an RMF is not going to tell you exactly how to do that. There's guide rails, there's ways that it'll navigate you through that, but it's not going to be super prescriptive. It's difficult to report compliance with laws, regulatory items, or any other compliance type of items, because it's not fitting into the box of those regulatory spaces or the laws that you may be subject to. So you'll have to do your own work in mapping your control set and your compliance and maturity to that control set to whatever regulatory factor or law or authoritative source that you want to demonstrate compliance and report against. There's little transparency when it comes to risk management frameworks because you're doing it all yourself. There's really no outside entity that is coming in and giving you an unbiased, or giving your stakeholders an unbiased look at where you are in your security and privacy programs. So it's really up to the business to create that transparency the best way they can in order for their stakeholders to get a certain level of comfort. And then the accuracy of it, much like the transparency, it really is reliant on the expertise that you have in-house in order to make sure that your assessment of your program and that you've mitigated risk is dependent on that person or that team and their expertise. So I'll pause there, just threw a whole lot of information out there. Mike, any additional comments?
All right, I think you summarized it well, and I think as the group will see as we continue the conversation, and as you mentioned, think about all of these different three categories of frameworks in a vacuum for a second, right? And I think what you'll see is the argument we're trying to make is that they're all relevant. And organizations that may be using just a risk management framework, although there's a lot of benefits, as Ryan pointed out, there's also a lot of limitations. Just like if you're only using a controls-based framework, you may not be getting insight into how you're addressing risk in the most efficient and effective way possible within your organization. So I think you nailed it. Although, a risk management framework and methodology is critical and core to an organization, we do need to recognize some of the limitations associated with only focusing on a risk management framework. And Brian, before you go any further, that might be a good pivot to the first polling question. And it looks like the majority of organizations have pointed to NIST, which is no surprise, right? I think we find and we see that is certainly the most common risk management framework that is used. And we were trying to be a little cute with this question. We phrased it to say controls-based risk management framework purposely, for which NIST is not, right? That is a risk management framework. And as Ryan mentioned, there is variation in terms of the controls that you can select in order to satisfy this by design. And there's a lot of benefits to that because not all organizations are created equal, but it lacks that level of prescription. And what we find is many organizations, if you look across a subset of organizations that are quote unquote NIST shops, call it 50, you'll see 50 different ways that organizations are addressing that. So it does lack this concept of consistency, and it lacks a lot of the prescription that organizations need to guide them in the right place. SOC 2, we'll talk about that a little later on, but that is not a controls-based framework nor a risk management framework. That's a reporting framework. COSO, again, we put that one in there as an oddball. Many organizations may be using it and don't even realize they're using it because COSO is components within many different control frameworks. And the HITRUST CSF is actually the only controls-based risk management framework within those options that we listed. And we'll talk about that a little later on.
Thanks, Mike. Poll results, not overly surprising to say the least. This is very common. So we're going to move on to a controls framework. So as Mike just mentioned, this is probably where the biggest gray area is for most organizations in their understanding is the difference between a controls framework and a risk management framework, because a lot of time you see them combined. But again, think about this, we're doing this in a vacuum. A controls framework is, again, exactly what it sounds like. It is a framework strictly focused on the controls. It does not consider risk. It does not consider how you would report against it. It is purely, these are the controls that we decided that we wanted to put in place. And then it's an audit of those controls and an assessment of your maturity against those controls. So it's a way of understanding control effectiveness more than controls and how they are minimizing risk. Again, that we're thinking about this in a vacuum. Understand that most frameworks that people try to use collide those two together, but they are very distinct and different. So the benefits of a controls framework is you're almost guaranteed to be in compliance with any regulations or laws because you're the ones that are picking the controls, and you can just pick whatever that regulation, law, or other authoritative source deems necessary. So you can kind of be in line with a reporting framework and demonstrate your compliance on your own doing that. It does provide a moderate level of assurance that what's in place is actually functioning, because it's to a degree very black and white. But some of the shortcomings of a controls framework is it's very easy for collusion to become a problem. If you have folks who, and I don't want to, paint a really negative picture, but they're afraid that, if it's discovered that there's this huge gaping hole, that may be a problem. So they can collude to try to cover that up. There's really no way of figuring that out because, again, there's no outside third party, unbiased party coming in and doing an assessment on that front. It's also really easy for management to decide, for a number of reasons, budgetary, resource constraints, political, whatever it may be, to override any findings from that control framework set. So these are all things that you have to be careful of if you're going to be strictly a controls-based framework. It's really, really rigid in the sense that it is telling you exactly what you need to put in place, how to put it in place. So it lacks that flexibility. It doesn't give you a lot of options in being agile or adopting it to your business. And then it may not specifically link with any kind of risk management methodology. So just things to consider. Again, I'll pause. Mike, any thoughts, anything you think I missed?
Yeah, I think that last one is important, Ryan, when you talk about, what I would refer to as the tailoring of a control framework. Oftentimes when we're working with a control framework or we're trying to decide what control framework to settle on from an organizational perspective, if we start with that step, we're probably misguiding ourselves. What you really need to start with, and we have them in this order on purpose, right, is to understand what risk of framework, what risk methodology, what risk assessment mechanism are we going to use to understand the relevant risk for our organization. And only then should you look to what controls or what subset of controls from a framework that you're going to implement and tailor in order to address those risks. I think what I've seen throughout my career, 22 years of Big Four consulting and doing controls assessments, is that a lot of organizations will just start with the control framework and say, well, we need to implement this across the organization. And they run into all kinds of challenges and issues, rightfully so, with their stakeholders that say, well, I understand, I need to do this very draconian control, but why? Why do I need to do this? What risk am I addressing in order to implement this? And oftentimes, just using a control framework, we're unable to answer that question, right? And justify the level of effort, the cost, the spend, the hours we're adding to people's day in order to execute that control. And so, there are limitations of just using and starting with a control framework without understanding the risk that I'm trying to address associated with my organization up front. I think that's the key point. I mean, there's obviously a lot of value to these control frameworks because they do help us to address risk. But if we don't understand the linkage between those and only use a control framework, we're going to miss the mark and more than likely do more than we need to, and in many instances do less than we should be doing.
Yeah, and if those of you out in the audience haven't figured out, we kind of set the stage that this is all in a vacuum, but you probably can tell that we're going to tie it all together after each framework, basically saying that they need to kind of come together. So we thought we were slick, but we're not that slick. All right, the last one that we're going to cover today is a reporting framework. So what these are designed to do is basically report compliance against known laws, regulations, other governing bodies, to make sure that you're doing what you need to do because you're working with CMS, or you're subject to HIPAA, or you are, subject to CCPA and all these other GDPR and all of these other kind of governing bodies, regulatory bodies that are saying that if you do X, Y, and Z, you need to prove to me that you're compliant. So it's not really rocket science, what a reporting framework is. It's exactly what it sounds like. There's lots of different versions of it. I named some. SOC 2 is another one Mike mentioned earlier. The good thing about them is it gives you a common language. It gives you a systematic methodology to an extent that the authoritative source or that governing body is telling you exactly what you need to show them. So it's really, really easy to compare your organization to other organizations, or understand if you want to do business with another organization where they are at in their maturity level, because you're using the same vocabulary. You're reading out of the same playbook. What it really does for you is it identifies key areas and focuses in your maturity against those. So I don't want to use the term transparent, but I'm going to. It's transparent in the way that you're basically telling whomever you're reporting to exactly where you stand against the guidelines that they put out there. And it's really easy to provide qualitative, and in some cases quantitative analysis to key stakeholders, whether those are internal or external. And in most cases, there's going to be a huge external stakeholder component to any reporting framework. All right, so what are the challenges? Kind of lacks some assurance depending on which framework you pick. Some require you to have an outside party come in and do an assessment. Some don't. Again, there could be collusion, there could be management override. There's a whole host of things that could come into play from that perspective. Consistency, Mike mentioned it earlier, really hard to attain with a reporting framework from organization to organization, because people view the requirements differently. And using healthcare as the example, everybody complained about HIPAA for the longest time. What does this mean? What do they want us to do? Very subjective. Transparency, I used it, I'm going to use it again. It's challenged. It's all based on the reporting party. So your organization being transparent ultimately is the only reliance that a consumer of that report can rely on. And it's a point in time assessment. I mean, a lot of these frameworks in a vacuum are point in time, but this is truly a point in time assessment, because what you're doing is you're telling somebody, hey, this is where I stand today. Tomorrow is a different story. Last week may have been a different story. Next year, definitely a different story. So it's important to keep in mind that the report, if you're a consumer of that report, you have to understand context, you have to understand perspective, you have to understand scope. So I'll put on my HITRUST hat for a second. We rely on a lot of different reporting frameworks in the HITRUST assessment work that we do. And it's really, really important for us as the assessors to analyze whether the report that we're reading covers the in-scope systems and the assessment that we're doing for that organization. Because if someone hands me a SOC 2 that has nothing to do with the environment in which I'm assessing, then that SOC 2 might as well not even exist. So it's really important to understand the context of a reporting framework. So Mike, tell me what I missed.
Yeah, I think you hit almost all of it, Ryan. So not to get on my soapbox when it comes to reporting frameworks, but the reality is a reporting framework doesn't work in and of itself. And I think you get the point we're trying to make, right? When you look at these in a silo, none of them are going to accomplish the full aspect of managing risk and being able to provide assurances and transparent and reliable assurances to your stakeholders relative to how you're managing risk from an information security and privacy perspective within your organization. Because let's face it, that's the ultimate goal, right? And whether those stakeholders are internal, whether they are our fellow employees, senior management, the board, investors, whether they're external, regulators, customers, potential investors, potential customers, other business partners. At the end of the day, why do we do this? Not just because it's good business practice, but because we want to let others know that we're doing it appropriately. So when you look at a reporting framework does nothing without some underlying controls framework, right, or an implementation of a set of controls to show that you've met the standards that are within a reporting framework, or in some instances, it could even be just policies and procedures, right, when you think about aspects of HIPAA, as Ryan mentioned before. But lots of limitations, and probably I would say that the one that most organizations don't realize that the limitations on are certainly the SOC reports, as you mentioned, Ryan, and a lot of the limitations that you listed here, things such as the fact that it's only historical looking or a point in time in assessment, the fact that there is significant flexibility relative to the controls that organizations include in order to meet those standards, which leads to a lack of consistency when you're trying to evaluate, right, the maturity of security and privacy programs. So when you think about a reporting framework, and there's certainly value in certain recognized, trusted, authoritative bodies, right, such as the ICPA that says, look, when you think about a security program, and this is something that didn't exist, 10, 15 years ago, when I first started my career in public accounting doing SOC 1s, or back then it was SAS 70s, this is something that they were trying to solve for. And they took a stance and said, these are the things that organizations should be reporting against. That's a stance. There's nothing wrong with that. However, it's one perspective. And looking at just that aspect or through that lens of one reporting framework is not going to give you a holistic picture relative to how organizations are managing risk, and certainly in not the most transparent way possible.
So let me get the right slide up. So ultimately, and obviously I gave you a peek behind the curtain, and you probably already knew that we were going in this direction, but it really is a combination of all three that you need to figure out. So how do we efficiently use all of these frameworks? Mike, I'm going to turn this over to you because I know you've got a lot of passion on this topic. Sure. So take it away.
Yeah. So obviously, as Ryan mentioned, we alluded to that throughout the conversation. We've already made some comments around that. So you need to think of this as, I can't just be a NIST shop, or I can't just be a COVID shop, or I can't just be a SOC 2 shop, right? You need to take a stance as to what elements of a risk management controls and reporting framework you're going to use in order to not only stand up and operate an information security and privacy program relative to addressing risk, put measurable aspects in place to show that you're meeting that program that can actually be implemented and operated across various stakeholders, i.e. the controls, if you will, and then decide on an assurance mechanism, which could be a reporting framework, in order to provide those assurances and that level of reliability to your stakeholders that you have the right set of controls in place that are addressing and managing the risk that is relevant to your organization. Right. So like the title of the webinar, alphabet soup, if you will, that's a lot of stuff to consider. And one of the things that I oftentimes like to talk about with many organizations that I work with is when somebody says, well, we use NIST. My next question is, well, what does that mean? when you say you use NIST? You use NIST for what? Do you use that as your risk management framework? Okay, that makes sense. Great framework. We've worked with NIST for years. Obviously very relevant, industry agnostic, very scalable, and certainly customizable relative to the controls that you use. But my next question is, okay, well, what controls or what control framework are you using in order to satisfy the components of NIST? What do you mean we use NIST? No. It needs to go beyond that, right? And then what mechanism are you using to provide assurances? So before you know it, with all these three different categories, not only can it get very confusing with all the different options and choices that are out there, but it can be a very daunting task in choosing which one from each category you're going to use and figuring out how do they all link together, and most importantly, how to tell the story, right, at the highest level to say, we've got our stuff together. We are addressing this appropriately. And how do you do that in the most efficient and effective way possible is a big challenge for many organizations. So, I won't go in all of these points in detail, but some things to consider. There's going to be a need to address all types of frameworks for most organizations. And even for those organizations where there may not be a need to provide, say, external assurances today, there will be, right? As you continue to do business, as you continue to grow, these demands and these requests for third-party assurance are only increasing. And it doesn't matter the size of the organization. I mean, Ryan and I are seeing 3 to 4 person startups being asked to produce, say, a SOC 2 report, for example, right? Or maybe a HITRUST certification. So that's becoming table stakes, not only with our current customers, but certainly in order to procure new business. And a lot of stakeholders across these organizations and our business partners and customers are getting smarter relative to, I need comfort that you're managing risk appropriately. Now, they may not necessarily know how to get that comfort by only looking at, say, a reporting framework, but these concepts of meshing and combining these different areas together is certainly something that the market is getting smarter about. The next point around, there's a significant effort and cost to harmonize across multiple frameworks. So the example I used before is when you look at the difference between a risk management framework, a control framework, and a reporting framework, the example that I gave, how much time is it going to take to crosswalk all of that? And to make the argument that, well, here's my risk register, and this is how these controls, I think, will address these risks. And this is the reporting framework, I think, will show you how I've effectively implemented these controls to address these risks. That's a lot of work. And not only is it a lot of work, but when you look at the way I explain how I've done it versus Ryan versus somebody else, you may get 3 different explanations. So if you're sitting there in the seat of a relying party or a stakeholder, you say, well, which one is right? Right? Is Ryan describing it correctly? Is Mike describing it correctly? Is somebody else? And that lack of consistency results in a lot of time and effort that's spent not only by us internally, but also externally by a number of our stakeholders. The ideal situation that organizations want to be in, and this is a term that we use, we've been using for years, Ryan and I together in the marketplace, is this concept of assess once, report many. So the ideal situation would be, how do you use a controls-based risk management framework, something that already has them linked together, so you don't need to do the guessing and do the linkage yourself. Not only does it have them linked together, but it gives you the ability to have linkage to different versions and flavors of each. So if you're a NIST shop, if that is your RMF that you're using, what is a set of standards of controls that I can implement in order to address the aspects of NIST? If you're ISO, what are the standards and controls that I can implement to address aspects of ISO? So the situation that we really want to be in is to have one centralized set of requirements that we can implement that we know address the relevant risks that we're concerned with, and that we can then provide reporting over in the form of an assurance mechanism in order to provide reliable, transparent assurances that we are addressing risk appropriately, right? So as opposed to, well, let me implement NIST, now let me implement my control framework, and now let me execute my HIPAA assessment, my SOC 2, my ISO certification, my PCI. Wouldn't it be great if I can just implement one set of controls, do one assessment against all of those, and pivot from that assessment to produce any reporting frameworks that I need to, is the ideal situation. So selecting a methodology that allows you to produce viable deliverables that will vary depending upon what you need is important. So from a risk management framework, I can certainly produce risk assessments. If I only have a controls framework, I'm not going to be able to produce a risk assessment relative to my organization. So I need a mechanism that's going to allow me to say, hey, you need a risk assessment from me, OCR, right? And in the HIPAA space, no problem. Here's my risk assessment. You want to know what controls I have in place and that I've implemented to address ransomware? No problem. I can show you what those are. And you want all of that in the form of an independent, validated certification report? I can do that too, through one mechanism, right? Through one standard set of resources. This is the ideal situation. As I mentioned, bits and pieces of all the frameworks should be used together. There's going to be a need to choose one, if not multiple, as we've seen. And forget about regulation for a second, right? I think as we all know, there's going to be multiple regulations that we need to provide assurances over. But we're really talking about the framework. So how many of us get requests from our customers, the example I used before, to the extent we're processing transactions and maybe that's card-related data. Well, we got to produce PCI, we got to produce SOC 2. Oh boy, now we're in healthcare space. Now I got to do this HIPAA thing. We're operating international. Somebody's asking me to do an ISO certification. I mean, before you know it, the audit fatigue and the reporting fatigue just grows and grows and grows and grows. And the cost associated with that is significant. One of my favorite stories I like to tell years ago when I was at PwC was having a conversation with the CFO of one of the largest health plans in the country. And my challenge to him, or my ask was, can you quantify the cost of compliance for your organization? And his response was, can't do that. And it doesn't matter because it's a necessary evil. And we have to ensure we are compliant, period. And my challenge to him was, actually, you can. And we've already done it, right, as part of our audit activities. We broke down all the different siloed operations relative to risk management, controls implementation, and reporting, and showed the significant crossover and duplication that existed within the organization. And it was to the tune of about 70%. And then you take that a step further, right? You quantify it in the form of headcount, the cost of overhead, the auditor cost associated with all those activities. And before you know it, within a year, we were able to reduce, not only quantify his cost of compliance, but reduce his cost of compliance by upwards of almost 70%. By implementing an assess once, report many approach. So I think you get the point. There is a way to do this in a more holistic approach and an integrated approach. And that's really the ideal situation for organizations to implement. Ryan, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, but we actually had 2 questions come through that I think is relevant right now based on this. So one of our attendees attended another presentation from Grant Thornton where they basically said HITRUST will not satisfy NIST 800-171. which is basically a condensed version of 800-53. And then this person continues that the confusion is that Coalfire certified Google Cloud as 800-171 compliant. How does HITRUST compliance validate compliance with 800-171? I have some thoughts on that, but I'll defer to you because obviously you're the expert in the room, and I'll add comments as necessary.
Sure. So I don't know if we're talking about 800-171 in its purity, or if we're talking about CMMC, or if we're talking about both. You know, a few nuances there. However, as we know, CMMC is certainly driven off of 800-171. So the thing to think about, again, 800-171, I would classify that as primarily a risk management framework, right? What HITRUST does is we certify the implementation of controls, and there's other aspects, right? Policies and procedures, et cetera. But we certify that you have implemented a set of controls that address aspects of risk management frameworks, okay? For example, anybody that says they are HIPAA certified is lying. It does not exist. And we see thousands of organizations that say, oh, we're HIPAA certified. No such thing. The closest thing that exists is a HITRUST certification. However, we don't say you are HIPAA certified. What we will say is we certify the implementation of an appropriate set of controls that address the risks associated with HIPAA, as an example. Same thing with NIST. So any organization that undergoes a HITRUST certification, they get a NIST CSF certification. And when you read that, it says we are certifying an appropriate implementation of controls that satisfy the NIST CSF. We're not certifying against NIST CSF, as an example. So it works the same way when you think about 800-171 and CMMC. We have an entire CMMC program. And by design, a risk management framework, it's not designed to be certified against. The design of a certification is over an implementation of controls that meet the requirements of a risk management framework. So whatever that individual may have heard, I would say there's certainly aspects of truth, right, to what you heard. But at the same time, there's aspects that maybe weren't clarified relative to how HITRUST ensures you get comfort and coverage over the implementation of controls that meet the requirements of 800-171, et cetera. It's a great question, and I love how that question aligns to a lot of the confusion when we think about our conversation today around frameworks. So really good question, Ryan. I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add, I agree with you. There's lots of nuance to this. In the question specifically, it says Coalfire determined that Google Cloud was NIST compliant. And you have to, taking that kind of as a alone statement, think about the fact that Coalfire said that. That's Coalfire attesting that they are. That doesn't necessarily mean anybody else is going to recognize that. That's kind of the rub with a lot of these frameworks is, you know, there are organizations that, Mike, to your point, will say you're HIPAA certified. Well, to them, you're HIPAA certified, but to the rest of the world, you probably are not. Right. So you have to take some of this and look at it from different perspectives to understand what people are trying to say. As far as what Grant Thornton mentioned, that is really kind of along the same lines of someone at the DoD ultimately is going to determine whether you are compliant to 800-171. There's not really a governing body that's going to determine that you are. So it's a little nuanced, and I know I wish I could give you a definitive answer, but it's just not that easy. And if we didn't answer your question specifically, feel free to throw another question in the chat box or reach out. Okay, like we got about 15 minutes left and a few more slides. So we have another poll coming up if we can launch it. So Mike was talking about assurance mechanisms. and I'll get on my soapbox really, really quickly about assurance, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Mike. Really, whatever framework, and again, what we're trying to convince you is that you really need all three. Whatever framework you choose, the level of assurance is really the critical factor. It is about providing your stakeholders, whether they're internal or external, the assurance that what you are reporting or saying you are from a compliance perspective is actually true. And how do you accomplish that? And we'll get into that a little bit in a future slide, but we just want to get a sense of what everybody is looking at out there. So Mike, I'll pass it back over to you going on to the next slide where we specifically talk about levels of assurance.
Sure, yeah. All right, great, thanks. So as we get into this, and we obviously do want to leave a few minutes, so I'm going to move rather quickly. Ryan and I want you to look at this through two different lenses. Not only as it relates to your own organization, because at the end of the day, we're all customers and we're all vendors, right? In some shape or form. We have organizations that are providing services, products, et cetera, to us, and we are providing services and products to someone else, right? So you really need to look at this through two different lenses, because the points around assurance and assurance mechanisms are relevant in both use cases, okay? So if I'm thinking about how do I know whether the assurances I am providing to my stakeholders are reliable, and how do I determine what type of assurance I'm going to choose to provide, just flip it a little bit and say, if I'm thinking about my third parties, my vendors, if you're in the healthcare space, your business associates, use whatever term you want, it's the same thing. As I get assurances from those business partners, how do I know they're reliable? And how do I know which mechanism to request, require, and use to give me the right level of assurance and transparency around security and privacy posture? Okay, so flip back and forth between those two lenses, and let's jump into some of the points that I think is relevant. So when you think about this concept of how do I know if assurances are reliable, there's a lot of things that go into this aspect of reliability, right? Well, assurances should be, in many instances, industry agnostic. So I want to use an assurance mechanism that's industry agnostic because my business may go across multiple industries. So if I'm in healthcare, I want some level of assurance that's going to give me insight into HIPAA, for example. But if I'm in manufacturing or retail, I want something that's going to give me assurances over, say, PCI, right? If I'm in another industry like travel and leisure, well, then I'm going for NIST, and I'm probably going for ISO. So having something that can give me industry agnostic assurances gives me more reliability around that mechanism and that level of assurance. Transparency, you've heard Ryan say it probably 4 times. You've probably heard me say it 10 times. It's absolutely critical. When we talk about transparency, how do you get information into what I refer to as multiple data sets relative to a business partner or our own organization? And again, not to pick on SOC 2, but I'm going to do it again. When you look at a SOC 2 report, because it's probably the most common reporting framework and mechanism that organizations use, sure, it's going to tell you a subset of hand-picked controls that management's put in place in order to address the principles that exist within that reporting framework. Yes, it's going to tell you whether, quote unquote, exceptions exist or not. Yes, it's going to tell you whether the opinion is, quote unquote, qualified. Think about all the subjectivity and judgment that goes into that, and how transparent is that process to us as the relying party. When we see an organization has an exception or a gap, and it doesn't even have to be SOC 2, it could be another mechanism. What does that mean? How close were they to not getting an exception? No clue. In instances where they don't have an exception, how close were they to potentially getting an exception, right? How much judgment was put into that? We have no idea. We only have one binary black or white data set relative to whether exceptions exist or not. And by the way, it's only telling us that historically. It gives us no comfort forward looking as to whether there's a potential risk of control degradation. We have no idea. It explicitly tells you you can't rely on it going forward. So there's a lot of lack of transparency, right? It has us asking a lot of questions. Will this continue to be a strong environment? I don't know. How close were they to maybe not passing? I don't know. How close were they to passing? I don't know. So having additional data sets around program maturity is critical. And that gives us an additional level of transparency across multiple elements of a program. Again, also, if we're only focused on whether controls are implemented or not, well, I care about policies and procedures. A risk that I care about is if Ryan is the only guy that's operating the most critical control within this vendor, what happens if he walks out the door and the way in which he operates that isn't documented? Nobody's going to be able to pick that up. So by default, it's going to fall down, it's going to fail, it's going to expose me to risk. So transparency, there's a lot of elements, and I define it as having as many different data sets as possible to get a full picture into that organization. That really dovetails into the next one around maturity indicators. We already talked about that it's difficult to obtain consistent assurances. So to have a higher level of reliability, we really want consistency relative to the standard and the implementation of controls. We talked about the limitations of some assurances being historical looking. That's not reliable, right, for forward looking relative to what we're doing from an organizational perspective. Oftentimes, they're glorified self-attestations. Think about these information security questionnaires. Guys, we're fooling ourselves if we think we're getting an appropriate level of assurance that is reliable through a proprietary information security questionnaire. It's only as good as the people that are responding to it and the amount of information, not to mention the individual that's responding to it. Oftentimes, it's somebody within sales and it's account manager. It's not even somebody within information security and privacy, and they're going to answer yes to as much as they possibly can so they can keep your business or win the business. We really need to challenge ourselves around those self-attestations. When you think about the auditors that may be doing these levels of assurance, what's the diligence that they're held to? I'll go back to AICPA for a second. When you look at SOC reports, there's only two levels of quality assurance that exist. It's the management assertion and attestation, and what that independent AICPA auditor provides you. Nobody's policing the AICPA auditors. The AICPA doesn't audit everything in every report. Yeah, there's a peer audit that happens every 3 to 5 years. I could say this, I did it for 22 years. But when you look at that relative to other mechanisms from a diligence perspective, it's night and day. And that gets to the last point around the levels of quality assurance. The more levels of independent quality assurance that exist, the more reliability I have from those mechanisms. Not all assurances are created equal. You know, the way that I like to sum this up is there's a lot of low-level assurances that exist in the marketplace. Information security questionnaires, type 1 SOC reports, glorified self-attestations, readiness assessments, a lot of self-attestations that exist. SIGs, shared assessments, all of that stuff, self-attestations, low level of assurance that I'm getting from those, which means there's a lot more I need to do in order to understand where the risk exists. And then there's some high level of assurance. HITRUST certification probably being the highest, at least one of the highest that exists. You know, ISO certification to a certain extent, SOC 2 report to a certain extent. We want to make sure, as I have here, we're not killing a mosquito with a cannon. We're not asking for too much. We're not asking for the vendor that's coming in and mowing the lawn to provide us a SOC 2 report. That's too much. But at the same time, we certainly want to make sure we're asking for enough. There's a significant market need for this concept of moderate assurances, right? Where do you strike that balance relative to risk? And one of the things that we're going to be introducing that's going to be net new to the marketplace is a new type of certification that Ryan and Intraprise are familiar with and will be executing alongside with us that we refer to as our I-1, which is an implementation-only certification. So those that are familiar with the full HITRUST certification, there's going to continue to be a need for that, especially when you think about authoritative sources and HIPAA compliance. You need to assess policy and procedure. But other organizations may be able to execute an I-1, which is a certification only over implementation to help address some of the risks within the marketplace. So just some perspective around assurances and being very careful when you choose what level of assurance you're going to execute and represent in the marketplace.
Sorry, I was answering a question. One thing I wanted to add, Mike, to what you're saying, and we have like 3 minutes left and a few more slides, is your comments about policies and procedures. And it's often thought of, and truthfully, HITRUST does it to a certain extent too. They weight the implementation higher than policies and procedures because you want something in place and not just a policy. And that makes complete sense. But those policies and procedures are designed and necessary to create resilience, because when there's an incident, that means your implementation has failed. So what do you do from that point? So it's not only the guideposts, but it's also kind of the plan on how to react. So they're just as critical as implementation, and I don't want that to be lost on anybody. Implementation is important, but policies and procedures and plans, super important as well. All right, I think we covered this one pretty well, Mike, unless there was anything that you wanted to bring up.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, and then this is kind of the big hurrah, like where we're driving towards, and I'll make a few comments, but then I'm going to pass it over to Mike. So as we've been alluding to this entire conversation, this is really all about a harmonization of all the types of frameworks, because there is no silver bullet. The controls-based framework is not going to satisfy or fix out all your problems. Neither is risk management, nor is reporting. So it's really the mechanism of bringing them all together. And truthfully, and you can see on the slide, there's really only one well-known, highly adopted framework out there, if any. I shouldn't even qualify it, that does all three, and that's the HITRUST CSF. And we have a table there, and I'll let Mike go into more details. But the reason why we provide those services for HITRUST is we're advocates for it, we're evangelists for it, because we know the value that it brings. I'm going to get off my soapbox, Mike. We're at time. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to share on this slide or anything else in the deck.
No, I don't think so. I think that the main point is we've done all this work for you guys, and we've harmonized the connection between risk management frameworks, control frameworks, and reporting frameworks. And we've done that to make this process the most efficient and effective way possible. And we continue to do that through our investments internally to keep it up to date. So if you're not looking at it or using it, I highly encourage you do. It'll make your life a lot easier, and for many organizations, it will help to rationalize your assurance approach as it exists today within your organization.
Yeah, and the one last thing I'll throw out there before everybody starts to bail, we talk about assurances. Mike brought up when you look at something like a SOC 1, there's only really 2 levels of assurance. There's by design almost 5 levels, or there is 5 levels of assurance with HITRUST. So you have the management attestation, just like a SOC 2. You have a third-party assessor, like the AICPA firms that come in and do their assessments. So third-party assessors like Intraprise come in, do a very in-depth assessment on your maturity. So it's not just a trust, but we also verify that these things are in place. Before we can even submit it to HITRUST, I have to have a completely separate team internal to Intraprise review that submission, that assessment, prior to submitting it to HITRUST from a quality perspective. So right there, we have 3 levels of assurance. Once it hits HITRUST, they have their own QA that gets kicked off. Once it gets through that, then their compliance team takes a look at it. So there's really 5 separate entities, if you will, that are increasing the level of insurance to give you and your stakeholders a level of comfort that what's in that report and your maturity is actually there. So I know we're 2 minutes over. I really appreciate everybody hanging tough, even though we went a little bit over. I'm answering one question we have right now. If there's any other questions that anybody has that we didn't get to address or you didn't get to ask, feel free to email myself and Mike. Our contact information is on the slide here. And with that, Siobhan, I will pass it back over to you.
I think you said everything that can be said. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will get to everybody with the slides. I know I've seen a couple of questions for that. We will be sending out the slides afterwards. Thanks all. Bye.